Welcome to the Marxist Workers Party's podcast, Izwi Labasebenzi, bringing reports and analysis of the news from a working class and Marxist perspective, fighting for jobs for all, a 12,500 Rand per month minimum wage and high-quality service delivery, organising to arm the workers and trade union movement with a revolutionary socialist and Marxist programme, building the struggle against capitalism and for working class political power and socialism. Welcome to this podcast from the Marxist Workers Party. Today myself, Shaun Arendse, and Weizmann Hamilton, General Secretary of the Marxist Workers Party, are having a further discussion based around Youth Day and the events of 16th of June 1976, and expanding on the material that we've recently published in the form of a new introduction to the republication of Weizmann's 1986 article, The Soweto Uprising. Now, in that article, Weizmann draws out the lessons of 1976. At the time of writing, he was drawing out the lessons for the young people struggling against apartheid and white minority rule. But the new introduction has tried to bring those lessons up to date to the situation that the youth face in 2021, because many of the issues ultimately remain very similar or even the same. Now, there's a number of points we want to expand on in having further discussion to underline some of the points in the material, and also to expand on some of the points that we weren't able to fully develop in the space of the new article. But before we come to all of that, we want to start the podcast by asking Weizmann to expand on his own experiences as a young person in 1976. The introduction to the new material briefly outlines Weizmann's experiences, which included periods of time in solitary confinement and detention, and a banning order, all in the weeks before the Soweto Uprising itself. Now, one of the key points that we deal with in the material is the evolution of the understanding of the political consciousness of the 1976 generation. And so I want to start, Weizmann, by asking you to expand on your own political evolution in response to the events of 76 and before, and the period of exile that you went into as the uprising broke out.
Yeah, thank you very much, Comrade Shaun. I consider the Black Consciousness movement as my political birthplace, because it is on the basis of these ideas that I developed an understanding of the necessity for the oppressed majority in South Africa to unify their forces in the struggle against apartheid. I grew up in a small township, a coloured township called Noordgesig, which is surrounded by African townships, and there was more or less a regular interaction, mostly of a fraternal nature, but nonetheless a separation between them. We considered it our duty as youth in a coloured township to promote the idea that, in spite of the fact that there were minimal differences in the conditions facing the African majority compared to the coloureds didn't have to carry a passbook, for example, that nonetheless these were the manifestations of the policy of divide and rule used first by colonialism and then subsequently by the apartheid regime, which came into power in 1948. And therefore, our responsibility, we believed, was to combat the ideas of those forces in our township, promoting the illusion that there was a separate solution for colored people as opposed to black people. And for us, black consciousness represented the idea around which we could unite all the oppressed, African, Indian, and colored.
So you look to those ideas first, as we explained most youth of your generation did in the struggle against apartheid. Today, you're the General Secretary of the Marxist Workers Party, so obviously your thinking evolved in a Marxist direction. Could you give some explanation of how that developed?
Yes, I think like many, if not most of our generation, we considered ourselves communists, mostly as an act of defiance against the Suppression of Communism Act by the apartheid regime. But in truth, we had only at best a primitive understanding of what communism, socialism, and Marxism was. And in my particular instance, it was going into exile and being struck by the social realities of the country into which I went for political asylum, and that's Botswana. Botswana was independent for 10 years already by the time that me and my comrades arrived. And the memory remains with me very starkly even today, that notwithstanding the fact that the people of Botswana had the right to vote, that it was a non-racial society, the social divisions were very, very stark. We crossed the border into Botswana at Bitsani Molopo, which is not far from Lobatsi, from where we proceeded to the capital, Gaborone. And as you enter Gaborone from the south, you have a massive, what we would call today a squatter camp, a place called Old Naledi. No water, no sanitation. And then you go further into the city and you begin to see big houses, tarred roads, electricity, water and sanitation. But the people occupying those parts of the city are also black. So clearly, neither the acquisition of the right to vote and neither the idea, nor the idea that the achievement of formal equality is necessarily going to result in social equality for all classes within society. And that made me recognize the inadequacy of the ideas of black consciousness, which, although a progression on the narrow African nationalism of the ANC, nonetheless did not provide the full answers beyond promoting the correct idea of the unification of as many sections of the oppressed as possible. And this set me on the road to search for ideas and an ideology that could explain the inequalities that existed not only in Botswana but in fact on the entire African continent, and why, without exception, independence on the African continent has made no difference to the lives of the majority of the colonized.
We'll just stay with it for one more question for this introduction, to just explain how you came into contact with the ideas of Marxism as represented by the Committee for a Workers' International, which the MWP and its predecessors going back to the late 1970s and 1980s is still affiliated today.
Well, when we went into exile, it was actually after we had sent my younger brother, Clarence Hamilton, the writer of Molo Fish, to go and explore on our behalf which organization we could be satisfied was serious about the liberation struggle, understood the message of the unity of the oppressed, and from whom we could obtain military training. But by the time that we arrived there, he had understood that none of the organizations in exile had a serious strategy even for the armed struggle, let alone a program and an ideology that would guarantee the eradication of inequalities between the classes within society. The proposal that he took with Sipho Buthelezi, one of the leading members of the Black Consciousness movement, to the ANC in Lusaka, where he went as a very young boy, of a united front between the ANC, the PAC, and the Black Consciousness movement, was dismissed by Alfred Nzo, whom they met, and the idea had to be abandoned. Recognizing that not only were they not serious about the armed struggle, something that was to be discovered, by the way, also by Tsietsi Machinini, had already been discovered by Tsietsi Machinini, the first leader of the Soweto Student Representative Council, by Khotso Seatlulu, his successor, and even by Chris Hani. We had to consider the implications of why the situation has arisen. And we came to the conclusion that because we were not adequately equipped politically to be able to analyze what had gone wrong on the African continent, so that those mistakes were not repeated in South Africa itself, we looked to the ideas of Marxism. And that drove us to understanding that indispensable to the struggle for a socialist society is internationalism. And therefore we wrote to a number of international organizations and asked them to apply the ideas of Marxism to society as it is today. And none of them satisfied us until we were fortunate enough to come across the ideas of the Committee for the Workers International through Comrade Thamsanqa Dumezweni, a veteran still involved in the struggle today, 80 years of age, as well as Comrade Welly Lenota and his father, who pointed us in the direction.
Moving forward to the situation today, on the 45th anniversary, there's of course been a lot of media coverage, particularly because it's the 45th anniversary of the Soweto Uprising. Every year there always is a lot of coverage, but this year maybe more so than previously. It's very interesting to listen to the different commentators, talking heads, analysts, so-called analysts on the radio and so on, discussing the crises faced by the youth today. The crisis in particular, of course, of unemployment, but also the still terrible situation in the schools. One of the points, of course, that features in the material that we've republished, that you wrote in the 80s, was the overcrowding, underfunding of the schools, the limitations and restrictions on the curriculum, and the final insult of the imposition of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction in terms of driving those protests. Most commentators would say that most issues have not been resolved. But how is that to be explained? The situation facing young people today, the similarities with the situation faced in the 70s and 80s in terms of the material and social conditions, but why has 27 years of black majority rule not resolved any of those issues?
Well, first of all, it is absolutely the case that if you were someone born in South Africa and confident that you can pursue your own dreams elsewhere in the world, that from 1994 onwards, South Africa would fulfill the expectations of the masses for prosperity for all, housing, education and health, and you came back 27 years later, you'd be struck by the similarities of the society you left in 1994 and the one that you find today. And what is the reason for that? Obviously, ever since 1994, there's been a growing grappling with this question amongst all layers of society, the working class and the youth in particular. And the difficulty, I think, that many have come up against is that they haven't had a scientific tool of analysis in order to be able to explain why this has happened in this way and not in any other. Why, in other words, all that has happened in South Africa is that we have, as someone once said, an Irish coffee society, black at the bottom, a little bit of cream on top, and sprinklings of chocolate on the cream itself. And this is the reason, for example, that from within the Fees Must Fall movement, deprived of such a weapon of analysis, have come to the conclusion that the ANC government, as some of them said, is anti-black, which is clearly absurd. So, what is the answer to this question? The reality is that as a capitalist party dedicated to elevating the aspirant black capitalist class into the capitalist order, the ANC was never going to be able to eradicate inequalities, because the capitalist system is based on inequalities between a tiny minority that owns the commanding heights of the economy and the majority of the working class who live only by selling their labor power if they're fortunate enough to have a job. The difference, though, is that shortly after coming to power, an already capitalist ANC was compelled to adopt a model of capitalism, neoliberalism, that had already been in force for over 30 years globally. And the implementation of that policy accelerated the inequalities that the ANC would have had to preside over in any event, and entailed a massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. And that explains the persistence of the inequalities that we have today. An ANC government based on a socialist program would have dedicated itself to mobilizing the resources of the country, which would have required the nationalization of the commanding heights of the economy under the democratic control and management of the working class, in order to raise the living standards of the working class, the black working class, to that level at least that the white working class had enjoyed, if not higher, and to raise along with that the living standards of all within society. On the basis of capitalism, the possibilities of achieving equality was always impossible and a utopian idea.
So building on that explanation, can we just return to the role of racism? Because, as you said, a number of commentators have been on the radio and the TV reflecting on 76 and explaining the so-called anti-black character of this black government. There are, of course, almost every month or two, there'll be some horrific example of racism that grips the national attention in the media. We've also, of course, recently had the accusations thrown against the new CEO of Eskom, that he's a racist and that he's not actually pursuing anti-corruption, but is driving out black businesses, for example, or other black executives and board members. So does racism play no role in explaining the inequalities that exist still in society?
Well, there's no question about it that even if the ANC had come to power on the basis of a socialist program, it would have taken a massive program of education to completely eradicate the racial prejudices that would have existed, particularly among those that had enjoyed its privileges in the past. But that cannot explain the phenomenon of racism today, because all sorts of social divisions, not only amongst whites and blacks, but amongst coloreds and Indians and blacks, between coloreds and Indians, and as we have seen, particularly since 2008, amongst black Africans to black Africans from other countries, have their roots in the social inequalities that derive directly from the incapacity of the capitalist system to meet the material needs of all.
So racism is one expression of class inequality.
Absolutely. So it couldn't have been the ANC's program, for example, to create inequality by lowering the living standards of the whites to that of the black population. The only way in which it could have been done in reverse is by the ANC securing control of the commanding heights of the economy, introducing in the place of the anarchy of the market a planned economy, and systematically raise the living standards to the same of the black population to being equal to that of whites, and even better. And under such circumstances, all the fears, all the anxieties about the loss of what little people had amongst coloreds compared to blacks, for example, or Indians compared to blacks, those fears would have been addressed by the fact that it was a government that had not only the commitment in terms of promises, but the material means by which to eradicate all these inequalities. The fact that the government undertook an economic, was based on an economic system that was inherently incapable of overcoming inequality, that had to reproduce inequalities all the time between the owners of the means of production and the working class, and moreover adopted a model that accelerated the process of inequality, meant that the outward expression of those inequalities in the form of the fears and resentments of different sections of the communities were going to persist and become inflamed even occasionally.
Now, one of the things we discuss in the new written material that we've published is the, especially in the 1980s or even from the late 70s, the role of the workers' movement and the trade union movement, within which the ideas of socialism and different variations of Marxism, not necessarily the Marxism that the CWI stands for, but the idea that the class struggle and not the racial struggle, so to speak, was central. That seems to be one of the missing ingredients in the situation in 2021. One of the missing ingredients in terms of the discussion that's taken place around the 45th anniversary. And one of the ways that we've seen the faction fights in the ANC play out has been the way that it's been described as a struggle between white monopoly capital and radical economic transformation, which claims to speak for the interests of all black people, regardless of class, or rather, let's say, it buries class. Now, from where we're sitting, I think we would agree that the clarity of socialist ideas that may have guided the struggle to a greater extent in the 70s and 80s is missing now. Could you expand a bit more on the situation in the trade unions and the ideological confusion that exists there, and how that's holding back, in fact, the struggle of the youth themselves?
Yeah, I want to take a step back a little bit historically before I address that question directly. When the ANC adopted the Freedom Charter in 1956, it wasn't a workers' gathering. It was a gathering of all the black oppressed. It was a multi-class Congress of the People, as it was called. And even though what brought the workers, the petty bourgeois, the small businessmen, lawyers, doctors, etc. together under one banner is their common grievance against capitalism, the aims, the social aims of the different classes were completely different, because the middle class, the small business people, and so forth, were aggrieved against colonialism then and apartheid over the fact that their ambitions to ascend into the summits of society were being frustrated by racial laws. And therefore what they wanted a non-racial society for is to be able to take their place in the ranks of the predominantly white capitalist class, to undertake or to indulge in the pleasures of the exploitation of the labor of the black working class, because that is what it amounted to. They could enrich themselves, just like the white capitalists, only by the exploitation of the labor of the black working class majority. But because they were such a weak and tiny social force, in order to be able to realize their class ambitions, they needed to mobilize the black working class as a whole to be able to fulfill those aspirations. Mandela makes it abundantly clear in an article written in 1956, published in a journal called Liberation in June 1956, an article headed "In Our Lifetime." And he makes it clear that whilst the Charter proclaims democratic changes of a far-reaching nature, it is by no means a blueprint for a socialist state, but a program for the unification of various classes and groupings amongst the people on a democratic basis. Now let me just interject there. When he says a program for the unification of various classes and groupings amongst the people on a democratic basis, he talks about formal political equality, but he does not mention the economic foundations on which that formal equality would rest. And the economic and social foundations would be the inequality that is inevitable under capitalism. He then goes further. Under socialism, the workers hold state power. They and the peasants own the means of production, the land, the factories, and the mills. All production is for use and not for profit. The Charter does not contemplate such profound economic and political changes. Now, I won't quote the whole thing. I'll go to the key part of the quote, where he provides the rationale for the policy of nationalization. He says that the breaking up and democratization of these monopolies will open up fresh fields for the development of a prosperous non-European bourgeois class. For the first time in the history of this country, the non-European bourgeoisie will have the opportunity to own in their own name and right mines and factories, and trade and private enterprise will boom and flourish as never before. In other words, it has always been the historic aims of the ANC to create a black capitalist class, and as expounded by Mandela here, implicit in that aspiration is the idea that the demographics of the capitalist class must reflect the demographics of the country. But what do we have today? The ANC, having compromised with capitalism, a compromise compelled on them by their historical class position, that they wanted to be part of the system and not to overthrow it, is that the summits of the economy remain dominated by what they call white monopoly capital. That is not really an accurate description of the situation, given the domination of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, for example, to the extent of nearly 40% and possibly more of the shares on the stock exchange. But what is striking is that black share ownership according to a study conducted by the economist Duma Qubule, is a mere 1.9%. Stripping away foreign share ownership and calculating black share ownership as a proportion of South African shares on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, the figure rises to a miserly 6.9%. And it is the failure of the black capitalist class to be able to realize their own aspirations to become the dominant demographic in a post-apartheid capitalist order that fuels the rage and bitterness and keeping alive of the idea that racism in South Africa has not been eradicated, when in fact the problem is that the roots of that racism, the capitalist system, have not only persisted, but have done so as a consequence of the conscious intention of the black capitalist class itself. They could not have a program for the overthrow of a system that they wanted to be a part of. And that is the root of the expression today, or the emergence today of what is known as the radical economic transformation faction.
So to return to the original question that I just asked, but maybe put it in a different way then, is does the working class have any interest in the, let's call it, the blackening of capitalism? Because some of the statements that we see from some trade union leaders certainly suggests that the working class should have an interest in whether their bosses or the owners of the companies they work in are black rather than white.
The working class has absolutely no interest in substituting their exploitation as cheap labor under the slavery of capitalism, if all that has happened is that the old white capitalist class has been removed by the black capitalist class. And on the basis of the experience of the struggle against national oppression, against racism, and against apartheid, the working class, through experience, came to the conclusion that the very same state machine that enforces their exploitation in the workplace is responsible also for their oppression in society as a whole. And consequently, they drew the conclusion more and more clearly the more the struggle intensified, that the struggle against apartheid and the struggle against capitalism are inseparable from each other. And on this basis, the working class drew socialist conclusions. And it is these ideas that attracted also the youth in the course of their own struggle. The graduates of 1976 in the workplace, already receptive to the idea of communism, of Marxism, as a result of the influence of the kind of banner under which the liberation struggle in southern Africa was fought, particularly in Mozambique by Frelimo, and also the MPLA, as well as ZANU, who promoted the ideas of Marxism and so forth, enabled the new entrance into the labor force to recognize the correctness of the conclusions that the working class already there had drawn, and therefore more and more to embrace the idea that it is not only for the end of apartheid that we are struggling, but for the end of capitalism itself. Now, the fact that the working class and the youth had drawn those conclusions, and that was very pronounced in the position that was taken by workers and youth in the mid-1980s, especially, and that explains that the banner at the back of the 1987 Congress of COSATU read, "Socialism means freedom." Those ideas were bound to bring them into collision with the aims of the struggle for an end to apartheid and white minority rule by the black capitalist class organized as the ANC. And consequently, the struggles that we see today are in reality the struggle between the contending ideologies, radical economic transformation on the one hand, and the struggle for socialism, more and more represented by SAFTU, that has taken over that banner from COSATU, is a reflection of the incompatible class interests that brought the working class and the black capitalist class together under one banner in the struggle against apartheid, under conditions where capitalism, the preservation of capitalism, was the principal aim of the ANC and their negotiating partners under the pressure and tutelage of so-called white monopoly capital and imperialism. So it's a resumption of the struggle for a program that has the best guarantee, an ideology that has the best guarantee for the emancipation of the working class. Just as the policies that were adopted by the ANC, the pro-capitalist policies that they had even before they adopted GER, were never going to address the problems of poverty, mass unemployment and inequality, so too were they incapable of addressing the expressions of those problems in the form of the repeated incidents of racism and so on and so forth. And therefore, the process that is unfolding is of a class separation and therefore an ideological separation between the working class and the black capitalist class that had placed itself at the head of the struggle for liberation with the consent of the working class. The working class over this period have come to understand that the aims and aspirations of the black capitalist class, organized as the ANC, are incompatible with their interests as a class. And that conflict of interest found expression in a bloody manner at the Marikana massacre. And that is the reason that the entire political terrain is being reconfigured. The emergence of SOFTU, in reality, is an expression of the rebellion against the pro-capitalist status quo post-apartheid that the ANC had presided over, and consequently a political rupture with the ANC inevitably followed. The logic inherent in this process is that SOFTU, in order to reconnect with the generation that had drawn those profound conclusions that socialism is the answer, must now do what it was not possible to do then, given the allegiance to the ANC, and create a mass workers' party on a socialist program as the true expression of the class, political and ideological independence of the working class itself.
One of the key contrasts that we make in the new introduction to your 1986 pamphlet is the different trajectory, or if not trajectory, the different pace of development of the clarification of the workers' movement in particular. So in the late 1970s, or rather going back to the early 1970s, the workers' movement was on an upward curve in terms of increasing its organisation, of leading more strikes with more impact and a more important role, which lasted through into the early 1990s and the developments around the negotiated settlement. And we outline how that had a gravitational effect on the youth movement, of how the youth went in tandem, hand in hand with the development of the workers' movement, with the youth themselves playing an important role in school boycotts in 1980, and then the decisive role in the outbreak of the 1984 to 85 uprising, and how in the founding of COSATU in the following year, really many of the militant traditions of the youth were united with the social weight of the working class in the foundation of COSATU. Now, coming forward to the last few years, of course, we've had the very significant and important Fees Must Fall movement, which inflicted a huge defeat on the then Zuma presidency over the question of a fee increase. But as you've already touched on, Fees Must Fall, the ideas certainly have not gone forward, have not rediscovered socialism, Marxism. I think in the pamphlet we even used the phrase have degenerated into very obscure racial and identity politics political ideas. And what we draw out is that the main difference between the 70s and the 80s and today is that although there have been very important developments in the workers' movement and the trade union movement, including the creation of SAFTU, which you've already mentioned, the ideological and political clarity is still missing. We're still going around the houses, the ideological houses, trying to rediscover the clear ideas of socialism. Can you maybe expand on that, and in concluding the podcast, link those points of the development of the workers' movement back to how that has impacted the ideas that the youth are being exposed to?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. I mean, if you look at the kind of messaging that comes on the commemoration of June 16th, it has been stripped of the revolutionary ideas that propelled that struggle, and has been turned into an attempt to justify the betrayals of the social aspirations of the youth post-apartheid, in the post-apartheid capitalist order. The youth are now being, by implication, blamed for the fact that they are socially deprived, jobless, unable to get access to decent quality education, by being called upon not to look for jobs, but to become entrepreneurs. It is a reactionary utopia to think that the problem of unemployment and so forth can actually be achieved. Now, to the extent that those ideas are being echoed by youth organizations, it's a reflection of the ideological disorientation that unfortunately the youth have become susceptible to as a consequence of the degeneration that occurred in the post-apartheid period, in particular within the trade union movement itself. So that instead of the organized workers' movement acting as a guide to a clear understanding of the basis for inequality within society, that it will require the unified struggle of the workers and the youth against capitalism to be able to overcome those, the idea has been promoted from within the trade union movement, particularly within COSATU, with all its investment firms, that in fact capitalism is the way forward for society. That degeneration, unfortunately, has acted as a point of reference for completely the wrong reasons, to particularly the privileged sections of black youth who think that going to university offers them an opportunity out of the swamp of poverty in which the black majority is currently mired. So I think this is the reason that the kind of messaging that you have on commemoration days is completely unhelpful to provide an understanding of what the basis is for the perpetual inequality that we see within society today. Unfortunately, notwithstanding the potential that the rupture in COSATU that led to the birth of SAFTU promised, there's insufficient ideological and political clarity within SAFTU itself, particularly within its leadership, about what the fundamental significance of the birth of SAFTU itself represented. And unfortunately, part of the reason for that is the residual effect of the ideological offensive mounted by capitalism in the wake of the restoration of capitalism in the former Soviet Union. And there's been a loss of confidence in socialism as an alternative to society. And that partly reflects the limitations of the current leadership, who never understood that in the first instance what existed in the former Soviet Union was not socialism, but was Stalinism in the overwhelming majority of the period of its existence, except the first 6 years. And that, in turn, is a consequence of the disproportionate influence that the South African Communist Party has had in the ideological outlook of a whole generation of trade union leaders who promoted the idea that in order to advance towards socialism, we must first create a democratic order, but don't say that democratic order has to be founded on a capitalist order, the workers must wait until the black capitalist class has ascended to the summits of the economy in correspondence with the demographics within society as a whole. The statistics that I've just cited is that in any case is impossible, clearly on the basis of what is being proposed. And this is what makes so interesting the proposal by a one-time political advisor, I don't know if he still is, to the leadership of the National Union of Metal Workers, NUMSA, calling upon the black capitalist class to enter into an alliance with the black working class to overthrow white monopoly capital has not even happened. And the reason that that is not possible is that under no circumstances would the black working class, having aided the black capitalist class to overthrow so-called white monopoly capital, agree to go back to being the slaves of the new capitalist masters whose skin happens to be black. In fact, the black capitalist class itself is terrified of even contemplating it. And this is why the South African Communist Party actually denounced Chris Malikane, because that would set into motion such an alliance to overthrow so-called white monopoly capital, the abolition of capitalism itself. The working class would use that process to bring into existence the foundation of a socialist society, and the aspirations of the black capitalist class would therefore never be realized. So in that sense, to the extent that the black capitalist class is aggrieved over the fact that they have so little privilege, so little opportunities to exploit the labor of the working class, it is a consequence of their own fears and their own terror that the working class might not agree to be their slaves. And that is why the future for the working class is in its own hands, to develop further the ideas that were implicit, for example, in the warnings by Joe Foster in 1982, the resolution adopted at the Special NUMSA Congress in 1993 for the creation of a Workers' Party, to turn those ideas into a program of action and the creation of a political party, a mass workers' party, democratically controlled, independent in terms of its ideology and class position within society, uniting all the struggles of the working class today and bringing the youth the kind of ideological and political clarity that will combat the reactionary utopian idea that the future of the youth lies in them becoming entrepreneurs themselves and being part of the same corrupt, bankrupt capitalist system, incapable increasingly of meeting even the most basic needs, not only in South Africa, but internationally.
Yeah, no, thanks, Weizmann. I think we'll have to leave it there. We organised this podcast to expand on the points in the new material that we've published, but I still feel that we've barely touched the surface of some of the issues that we could. I think we'll be returning in future podcasts to particularly the issues of the development of the trade union movement and so on. But maybe if we just leave the podcast on some of the points that we conclude the new booklet on. The new introduction to your 1986 article, we pose it as an appeal to the youth, is to understand, to see that the crisis in working class leadership that exists, the need for the political rearming of the workers' movement, of clarifying the need for a socialist programme based on the ideas and analysis of Marxism, is not just the task of workers in the trade unions to rediscover and to rebuild, but is the task of the youth as well, and that the youth must see the overcoming of the crisis of working class leadership that you've explained and developed, and that we're going to return to in future material, as part of the struggle of the youth building and organising campaigns on the issues that most immediately affect them, but then in linking those struggles to the struggles of the workers and the struggle to fundamentally transform society, the socialist revolution, in other words, as the only way to bring those lasting fundamental change to their future and their life chances.
Yeah, our appeal to the youth of today's generation is to make conscious the conclusions that the youth, particularly of the 76 generation, came to on the basis of experience, recognizing the limitations of the power of the youth on their own. They turned to the working class, as we describe in the publication. Today, the youth must turn that into a conscious understanding, recognizing that the only class within society capable of overthrowing capitalism and bringing about a socialist transformation of society is the working class itself, and that the power and elan and creativity and fearlessness of the youth combined with the power of the working class would be an unstoppable force.
We appeal to young people, if they're interested in the ideas that we've discussed today, the ideas that are in the new booklet, which can be read on the MWP's website. You can also contact us for a hard copy. That if the youth are interested in those ideas, of deepening their understanding, of understanding the ideas of Marxism and of socialism, to work with us in building, in reality, a youth wing of the Marxist Workers Party, which at this stage we're calling a Marxist youth movement, to fight for those ideas within the schools, the colleges, the universities, amongst young workers in the workplaces, and that at every stage such an organisation would link those struggles of young people to the struggles taking place within the communities and the workplaces, and especially the organised working class in the trade unions, to rebuild that tradition of united struggle from the 1970s and the 1980s, which we describe in the booklet, as the music of the future for the 2020s, as the crisis of capitalism continues to unfold and the working class fights back against it. If you have any questions or comments about the contents of this bulletin, please let us know, and we may try and respond in future bulletins. Also, if you know about or are involved in any struggles you would like us to report on, whether that is in your workplace, your community, your university, college or school, or have any suggestions of future topics that you would like us to cover, please contact us. The Marxist Workers Party is an affiliate of the Committee for a Workers' International, the CWI, building global working class unity in the struggle for a socialist South Africa, a socialist Africa, and a socialist world. If you would like to join the Marxist Workers Party or find out more about us, including building the CWI in Southern Africa, please visit our website at www.marxistworkersparty.org.za, find us on Facebook and Twitter, or call or WhatsApp us on 081 366 7375.